Whoever makes a beast of himself gets rid of the pain of being a man. There exists within each of us a primal fire, ancient and terrible, that can reduce years of love to ashen moments, transform the gentle into monsters, and make strangers of those we thought we knew. The Greeks called it menos, the divine fury that seizes warriors in battle. The Romans named it furor, a madness indistinguishable from possession. We call it rage. And it remains perhaps the most misunderstood and feared of all human emotions. The word rage derives from the Latin rabies, meaning madness or frenzy, the same root that gives us rabid. In ancient understanding, rage was not merely an emotion but a form of temporary insanity, a state in which the rational mind surrenders to something far older and more dangerous. The Sanskrit word krodha describes a burning anger that consumes like wildfire. In Greek, thumos refers to that spirited part of the soul associated with indignation and vital force, while menos denotes the specific wrath of the gods, an anger so terrible it shapes the fate of nations. The first word of Western literature is menos rage. Thus begins Homer's Iliad. Sing, O goddess, the rage of Achilles, son of Peleus, that brought countless ills upon the Achaeans. The entire epic unfolds from a single moment of wounded pride, when Agamemnon dishonors Achilles by taking his war prize. Achilles withdraws from battle, and his rage, his divine wrath, sets in motion a chain of destruction that will claim thousands of lives, including that of his beloved Patroclus and eventually his own. This is not ordinary anger. It is menos, the terrible fury that belongs to gods and heroes, a force so overwhelming it transcends individual will and becomes destiny itself. What the Greeks understood, and what we have largely forgotten, is that rage exists on a spectrum of intensity that begins with human emotion and ends in divine possession. When Achilles finally returns to battle, Homer describes him as possessed by a fury that makes him something other than human. He becomes a force of nature, unstoppable, merciless, fighting even the river god itself. This is the archetypal image of rage at its apex, the warrior who has ceased to be a man and become pure destruction. In Hindu mythology, we encounter Kali, the dark goddess whose rage is both terrifying and sacred. When demons threatened the cosmic order, Kali emerged from the forehead of Durga, black as night, adorned with severed heads and dripping with blood. Her rage was so absolute that after slaughtering the demons, she could not stop. She danced the dance of destruction, threatening to unmake creation itself, until her consort Shiva threw himself beneath her feet. Only then, feeling the body of her beloved beneath her, did she cease, her tongue protruding in shock at what she had nearly done. The image is profound. Rage so consuming it cannot distinguish between enemy and beloved, destruction so total it threatens even the self. Yet Kali is not evil. She is the necessary destroyer, the force that clears away what must die so that new life can emerge. Her rage is cosmic, impersonal, the fire that burns through the universe in endless cycles of creation and destruction. She represents rage in its archetypal form, beyond good and evil, beyond morality itself. The ancient Egyptians told of Sekhmet, the lioness goddess, the Eye of Ra, sent to punish humanity for its transgressions. She began to slaughter humans with such ferocity and joy that Ra himself grew alarmed. To stop her rampage, he tricked her by dyeing beer red to resemble blood and flooding the fields with it. Sekhmet drank deeply, believing it to be the blood of her victims, and became so drunk she forgot her rage and transformed back into the gentle Hathor. The message is clear. Rage, once unleashed, develops a momentum of its own, a terrible inertia that even gods struggle to halt. These myths are not primitive superstitions, but profound psychological insights rendered in symbolic form. They tell us what depth psychology would later confirm, that rage is an autonomous force within the psyche, an affect so powerful it can overwhelm the ego and act through us rather than be directed by us. When someone says, "I don't know what came over me," they speak a literal truth. Something did come over them. The Greeks would say they were seized by a daemon. Jung would say the shadow erupted. The neurobiologist would speak of limbic hijack. All describe the same terrifying phenomenon, the loss of oneself to fury. But we must make crucial distinctions. Rage is not anger, though it exists on the same continuum. Anger is proportionate, directed, and purposeful. It arises in response to perceived injustice or boundary violation and seeks to correct the situation. Anger says, "This is wrong and must change." It can be expressed, negotiated with, and resolved. Rage, by contrast, is disproportionate, diffuse, and apocalyptic. It does not seek correction but annihilation. Rage says, "You must be destroyed." Where anger preserves relationship even as it protests, rage severs all connection. Where anger remains tethered to the rational mind, rage breaks free entirely. The fire of anger can warm and illuminate. The fire of rage consumes everything, including the one who carries it. This is why myths depict divine rage as a double-edged sword. When the gods grow wrathful, mortals suffer, but the gods themselves are diminished by their fury. Achilles gains glory but loses everything he loves. Kali nearly destroys the cosmos, including herself. Sekhmet's bloodlust blinds her to the very purpose she was meant to serve. The pattern repeats. Rage promises power but delivers devastation. Psychologically, these myths reveal rage as an archetypal pattern residing in the collective unconscious, a potential that exists in every human psyche regardless of culture or epoch. It is part of our inheritance as creatures who evolved in a world where survival sometimes demanded absolute, overwhelming aggression. The warrior who could tap into berserker fury had an advantage in battle. The mother who could unleash terrible protection of her young increased their chances of survival. Rage, in its original context, was adaptive. The problem is that this ancient mechanism persists in a world where it is rarely appropriate and almost always destructive. To understand rage psychologically, we must first understand what burns beneath it. Rage is never a primary emotion, though it often appears first and most powerfully. It is what we might call a guardian emotion, standing watch over deeper, more vulnerable feelings that the psyche cannot bear to experience directly. Beneath rage lies a wound so painful that the mind instinctively reaches for fury as a kind of anesthetic, a way to avoid feeling what must not be felt. Carl Jung understood rage as an eruption of shadow material, those aspects of ourselves we have rejected, denied, or deemed unacceptable. The shadow contains not only our forbidden desires and shameful impulses, but also our legitimate aggression, our healthy capacity to say no, to protect boundaries, to fight when fighting is necessary. When we repress this natural assertiveness, when we become too civilized, too accommodating, too afraid of our own strength, the shadow grows dense and volatile. What could have been expressed as clean anger becomes compressed into something far more dangerous. The shadow does not disappear through denial. It gathers in the depths, accumulating pressure like magma beneath the earth's crust. The longer it remains unacknowledged, the more explosive it becomes when it finally breaches the surface. This is why the gentlest people can shock us with sudden, disproportionate fury. This is why those who pride themselves on never getting angry often harbor the most volcanic rage. They have not transcended anger. They have merely buried it alive, and what is buried alive remains alive. Jung wrote extensively about the danger of identifying too strongly with the persona, the social mask we present to the world. When we mistake our persona for our true self, when we believe ourselves to be only the good, rational, controlled individual we show to others, we create a psychic split. Everything that contradicts this idealized self-image gets consigned to the shadow. The problem is that the shadow, though unconscious, is not inactive. It influences our behavior in ways we cannot see, leaking out in passive aggression, bitter sarcasm, chronic resentment, and eventually, if suppressed long enough, in explosive rage. Marie-Louise von France recounts the case of a man who came to analysis complaining of sudden, uncontrollable rages that seemed to come from nowhere. He described himself as a peaceful person, someone who avoided conflict, who prided himself on his patience and understanding. Yet periodically, usually after weeks of mounting tension, he would erupt over trivial matters, screaming at his wife, throwing objects, saying things he immediately regretted. In analysis, it became clear that he had spent his entire life swallowing his anger, trained from childhood to believe that anger was dangerous, destructive, unacceptable. His shadow had become a pressure cooker of accumulated rage, and the lid could only hold so long. The wound beneath rage is almost always a wound to the self. Psychologist Heinz Kohut identified what he called narcissistic rage, the fury that erupts when our sense of self is threatened or damaged. This is not narcissism in the colloquial sense of vanity or self-obsession, but rather a fragility in our core sense of being. When we are humiliated, dismissed, invalidated, or made to feel powerless, something essential in us fractures. Rage rushes in to cover the crack, to protect us from feeling the unbearable shame or helplessness beneath. Shame and rage are intimately connected. Shame is the feeling that there is something fundamentally wrong with us, that we are defective, unworthy, less than. It is an annihilating emotion, one that threatens our very sense of existing as a valuable being. Rage offers an escape from this intolerable feeling. When we rage, we feel powerful rather than powerless, righteous rather than worthless. The pain of shame is transformed into the heat of fury, and for a moment, we are saved from having to feel how small, how vulnerable, how deeply wounded we truly are. This is why criticism, even mild or constructive, can trigger disproportionate rage in some individuals. The criticism touches the shame wound, and rage erupts as a defense. This is why perceived disrespect can lead to violence. The disrespect activates a deep sense of worthlessness, and rage attempts to restore the damaged self through domination or destruction. This is why powerlessness so reliably generates fury. When we cannot control a situation, cannot make ourselves heard or seen, cannot protect what matters to us, rage offers the illusion of power even as it demonstrates our actual impotence. We must distinguish between healthy anger and pathological rage. Healthy anger is proportionate to the situation, directed at the actual source of the problem, and seeks a resolution. It arises, expresses itself, and dissipates once the boundary is restored or the injustice addressed. It is a signal that something is wrong and needs attention. It preserves relationship even as it protests against violation. A parent's anger when a child runs into traffic is healthy. It communicates danger and establishes necessary limits. A friend's anger when boundaries are crossed is healthy. It clarifies what is acceptable and maintains the integrity of the relationship. Pathological rage, by contrast, is disproportionate, often displaced onto targets that are not the actual source of the wound, and seeks not resolution but annihilation. It does not dissipate after expression, but seems to feed on itself, growing more intense the longer it burns. It destroys relationship rather than preserving it. It is not a signal but a conflagration. The rage that erupts over a minor slight and leads to physical violence is pathological. The rage that nurses itself over years, planning revenge, feeding on bitterness, is pathological. The rage that cannot distinguish between present irritation and ancient wound is pathological. The neurobiological dimension of rage cannot be ignored, though we must be careful not to reduce the phenomenon to mere chemistry. When we perceive a threat, the amygdala, our brain's alarm system, can trigger what Daniel Goleman termed an amygdala hijack. Stress hormones flood the system, the prefrontal cortex goes offline, and we lose access to rational thought, perspective, and impulse control. We are, quite literally, not ourselves. The thinking brain has been overridden by the survival brain, and the survival brain knows only fight, flight, or freeze. But this neurobiological explanation, while accurate, is incomplete. It tells us the mechanism, but not the meaning. It explains how rage happens in the brain, but not why certain stimuli trigger the amygdala in the first place. Why some people have hair-trigger alarm systems, while others remain calm under pressure. For that, we must look to personal history, to the patterns laid down in childhood, to trauma and attachment wounds that have sensitized the nervous system to perceive threats where others see only minor frustrations. The question is not whether we have rage within us. We all do. The fire is part of our inheritance as human beings, part of the shadow that accompanies consciousness like a dark twin. The question is what relationship we have with that fire, whether it controls us or we have learned to contain and direct it, whether it consumes us or, through great effort and awareness, we transform it into something that can illuminate rather than destroy. The philosopher who understood rage most profoundly was perhaps Friedrich Nietzsche, though he rarely used the word itself. Instead, he wrote of ressentiment, a French term he adopted to describe a particular species of festering resentment that characterizes what he called slave morality. Resentment is rage fermented in powerlessness, the fury of those who cannot act directly against what oppresses them and so turn their aggression inward, poisoning themselves with bitterness while fantasizing elaborate revenges they will never enact. Nietzsche observed that those who lack power in the world often develop a morality that inverts all values, declaring their weakness a virtue and the strength of others a vice. The meek shall inherit the earth, they proclaim, not because they believe it, but because they must believe it to survive their own impotence. This inversion is driven by rage, a rage so profound and so hopeless that it can only express itself through moral condemnation, through the secret satisfaction of judging and resenting those who possess what they cannot have. It is the rage of the office worker who dreams of his boss's downfall but never speaks up in meetings. It is the rage of the betrayed lover who cannot leave but punishes through silence and withdrawal. It is rage without outlet, rage turned against itself, rage that makes one sick. This is the danger of unexpressed rage. It does not disappear but rots inside us, becoming resentment, becoming chronic bitterness, becoming a lens through which we see the entire world as hostile and ourselves as perpetual victims. Nietzsche considered this the most life-denying of all psychological states, a slow spiritual suicide in which we preserve our pride by nursing our wounds rather than healing them, by blaming rather than acting, by resenting rather than overcoming. The Stoic philosophers approached rage from a different angle, but reached a similar conclusion about its destructive nature. Seneca, in his treatise on anger, argued that rage is a temporary madness, a form of insanity that we foolishly excuse in ourselves while recognizing it clearly in others. He wrote that no plague has cost the human race more, that anger leads to slaughter, to the devastation of cities, to the extinction of entire peoples. Unlike the Stoic acceptance of other emotions as natural and potentially useful, Seneca saw nothing redeemable in rage. It is, he insisted, always excessive, always irrational, always destructive. Seneca's remedy was delay. The greatest cure for anger, he wrote, is time. For time reveals what seemed urgent as trivial, what felt justified as absurd. When rage seizes you, do nothing. Wait. Let the fire burn itself down before acting on its impulses. He recounted the story of a Roman general who, when angry, would count to 10 before speaking. Another would leave the room and walk around the building. These are not sophisticated psychological techniques, but they acknowledge a fundamental truth. Rage distorts perception and judgment, and any action taken while possessed by it will likely be regretted. The Stoic position might seem emotionally sterile, a kind of repression through philosophy, but there is wisdom in recognizing that certain states of mind are incompatible with clear thinking and ethical action. Rage makes us stupid. It narrows our vision to a single point, blinds us to complexity and nuance. converts human beings into objects deserving destruction. Under its influence, we say and do things that damage irreparably, that cross lines we swore we would never cross, that transform us into the very thing we despise. Yet there exists another dimension of rage, one that the Stoics perhaps did not fully consider: existential rage, the fury that arises not from personal wound or social humiliation, but from confrontation with the fundamental conditions of existence itself. This is the rage Dylan Thomas articulated when he wrote, "Do not go gentle into that good night. Rage, rage against the dying of the light." This is rage against mortality, against the fact that we and everyone we love will die, that everything we build will crumble, that time devours all. Albert Camus explored this existential fury in The Rebel, arguing that metaphysical rebellion, the refusal to accept the absurd conditions of human existence, is a defining characteristic of modern consciousness. We rage against a universe that seems indifferent to our suffering, that offers no inherent meaning, that allows the innocent to suffer and the guilty to prosper. This rage can lead to nihilism and destruction, as it did in the 20th century's totalitarian movements, or it can fuel the determination to create meaning despite the void, to assert human dignity in the face of cosmic indifference. There is something noble in this existential rage, something that differentiates human beings from animals who accept their fate without protest. We are the creatures who look at death and say no, who confront injustice and demand change, who refuse to accept the world as it is and insist it could be otherwise. Without this capacity for righteous indignation, for holy fury at what is wrong, there would be no progress, no reform, no revolution. The abolitionists raged against slavery. The suffragettes raged against disenfranchisement. The civil rights movement channeled collective rage into transformative action. But we must distinguish between righteous anger and self-righteous rage, between justified indignation and the intoxication of moral superiority. Righteous anger focuses on specific injustices and seeks concrete remedies. It is disciplined, strategic, and willing to negotiate. Self-righteous rage, by contrast, feeds on its own sense of virtue, divides the world into absolute good and evil, and seeks not reform, but retribution. It enjoys its own fury, becomes addicted to the feeling of being right and wronged, and ultimately cares more about the purity of its rage than the achievement of its stated goals. In our current age, we see rage operating as a social and political force with unprecedented intensity. Social media platforms have discovered that rage drives engagement more reliably than any other emotion. Algorithms learn to feed us content that provokes outrage because outraged people click, share, and comment. We have created rage economies, systems that profit from keeping populations in a constant state of fury. The result is a culture of perpetual indignation, where nuance dies, where complexity is reduced to tribal allegiance, where the other side is not merely wrong but evil, not merely mistaken but monstrous. This collective rage functions as a kind of mass psychosis, a shared delusional state in which we project our shadow onto designated enemies and experience our own aggression as righteous defense. The left rages at the right rages at the left, and both sides are convinced of their own victimhood and the other's villainy. We have forgotten that the person we rage against is also a human being, also someone's child, also struggling with their own wounds and fears. We have replaced empathy with enmity, dialogue with denunciation, understanding with the ecstatic pleasure of collective hatred. This is the shadow of democracy itself, the dark side of giving voice to the people. When that voice is one of rage, when demagogues learn to play on resentment and fear, channeling the accumulated frustrations of the populace towards scapegoats, we get fascism, genocide, the complete breakdown of civilization. History shows this pattern repeating. Economic crisis breeds anxiety. Anxiety seeks someone to blame. Blame curdles into rage. Rage demands blood. The 20th century's horrors began with rage weaponized, with entire populations convinced that their suffering was caused by identifiable others who must be destroyed. Yet rage is not inherently political or collective. At its core, it remains an intensely personal experience, a fire that burns in individual hearts. The question each of us must ask is not whether we feel rage we do. We will, but what we choose to do with it. Whether we feed it or starve it, whether we let it use us or find ways to transform its energy into something other than destruction. The seeds of rage are planted early, often before we have words to name what we feel or memory to recall what shaped us. The infant who cries in hunger or discomfort and receives no response, who reaches for the mother and finds emptiness, experiences what psychoanalyst Donald Winnicott called primitive agony. This is not yet rage, but something prior to it, a fundamental rupture in the expected order of things, a betrayal of the implicit contract between helpless infant and protective world. When this rupture occurs repeatedly, when a child's needs are chronically unmet or unpredictably met, the groundwork for later rage is laid. The infant exists in a state of what Freud termed primary narcissism, a condition of imagined omnipotence in which the world exists to serve the self. The breast appears when hunger strikes, warmth arrives when cold threatens, discomfort is magically relieved by powers the infant cannot yet distinguish from itself. Gradually, through thousands of small frustrations, the child must learn the terrible truth. You are not the center of the universe. Your needs will not always be met. You are separate, vulnerable, and fundamentally dependent on others who have their own needs and limitations. This necessary disillusionment, when it occurs gradually and within a context of sufficient love and responsiveness, allows the child to develop healthy aggression, the capacity to assert needs, to tolerate frustration, to negotiate with reality. But when the disillusionment is too sudden, too total, or occurs in a context of neglect or abuse, the child's psyche cannot integrate it. Instead of developing into healthy assertiveness, the aggression curdles into something more primitive and dangerous. It becomes rage held in the body, a permanent readiness for betrayal, an expectation that the world will fail and hurt, and a determination to strike first or strike back with overwhelming force. The child who is not seen, whose emotional reality is dismissed or invalidated, learns that their inner experience does not matter. When they express hurt and are told they are too sensitive, when they show anger and are punished for it, when they display need and are shamed for weakness, they learn to hide themselves. But the feelings do not disappear. They accumulate in the shadow, festering in darkness, waiting for the moment when the defenses finally crack and everything held back comes flooding out in a torrent of undifferentiated fury. Parental rage also leaves its mark, not through genetics but through modeling and traumatic imprinting. The child who grows up in a household where rage is regularly expressed, where doors slam, voices rise to screaming, objects are thrown, threats are made, learns that this is how conflict is handled, how power is asserted, how one responds to frustration. Even if the child consciously rejects this pattern, even if they swear never to become like the raging parent, the template is installed. It lives in the nervous system, ready to activate under sufficient stress. This is why so many people find themselves in moments of fury, speaking with their father's voice, gesturing with their mother's hands, becoming the very thing they fled. Trauma compounds these early patterns, creating what we might call frozen rage. When a person experiences overwhelming threats and can neither fight nor flee, when they are trapped in situations of ongoing abuse or danger, the rage that would naturally mobilize them into action has nowhere to go. It becomes locked in the body, held in chronically tightened muscles, shallow breathing, perpetual vigilance. Bessel van der Kolk writes in The Body Keeps the Score that trauma survivors often oscillate between numbness and rage, between shutting down completely and exploding disproportionately because their nervous systems have lost the capacity for modulated response. Post-traumatic rage can be triggered by stimuli that seem irrelevant to observers but carry profound unconscious associations for the survivor. A tone of voice, a facial expression, a feeling of being trapped or controlled, These can activate the traumatic memory and the rage that was never expressed at the time of the original violation. The person rages not at the present situation but at the past one, though they experience it as completely justified by current circumstances. They are, in a sense, fighting a battle that already happened, trying to win retroactively what was lost long ago. The expression and acceptability of rage differs profoundly between masculine and feminine development, shaped by cultural permissions and prohibitions that begin in earliest childhood. Boys are often socialized to suppress all vulnerable emotions, sadness, fear, tenderness, while rage and aggression remain acceptable, even encouraged within certain bounds. The phrase, boys will be boys, excuses, aggressive play, territorial fights, expressions of dominance. For many males, rage becomes the only socially acceptable emotional outlet, the sole channel through which all other feelings must flow. This creates what psychologist Terry Real calls covert depression in men, a condition in which sadness, grief, and fear are automatically converted into irritability and anger, because these are the only feelings a man is permitted to experience without shame. The boy learns early that crying is weakness, that expressing hurt makes him a target, that the only safe emotion is anger. By adulthood, this pattern is so deeply grooved that he may genuinely not recognize that beneath his chronic irritation and explosive rage lies a well of unacknowledged grief and terror. For girls and women, the opposite conditioning often applies. Female anger, and especially female rage, is pathologized and punished. The angry woman is hysterical, shrill, a harpy, a bitch. From childhood, girls learn that anger makes them unlovable, that expressing fury violates the feminine ideal of nurturing, accommodation, and emotional caretaking. Female rage must be hidden, apologized for, converted into tears or depression, or turned inward against the self. The result is that women's rage often emerges indirectly, through passive aggression, through somatic symptoms, through depression that is anger with nowhere to go. Yet, the archetypal feminine contains profound rage. Kali, Sekhmet, the Furies, Medea, these mythological figures express a rage that is not pathological but sacred, not weakness but terrible power. The suppression of healthy female rage has profound costs, not only for individual women who internalize their fury until it makes them sick, but for culture itself, which loses access to the fierce protection, the necessary destruction, the transformative fire that the feminine brings when roused to righteous fury. The narcissistic wound that Kohut identified operates differently but with equal devastation across genders. This wound occurs when the developing self does not receive adequate mirroring, when the child's essential being is not recognized and affirmed. The result is a fragile, unstable sense of self that depends on external validation to maintain cohesion. When this validation is threatened or withdrawn, when the person feels unseen, dismissed, humiliated, or disrespected, the fragile self fractures and narcissistic rage erupts to defend against the unbearable experience of disintegration. This rage is characteristically cold, calculating, and merciless. It seeks not merely to defend, but to destroy utterly, to eliminate the source of the narcissistic injury. It is the rage of the spurned lover who cannot tolerate rejection and so ruins the beloved's reputation. It is the rage of the inadequate leader who cannot bear criticism and so crushes all dissent. It is the rage that says, if I cannot have you, no one will. If you will not admire me, I will make you fear me. If I cannot be loved, I will be powerful. The developmental origins of rage remind us that those who rage most terribly are often those who were most terribly wounded. This does not excuse the damage rage causes, does not absolve responsibility, does not mean we must tolerate abuse, but it does complicate the simple morality tale in which the angry person is simply bad and the victim simply innocent. It reveals rage as a symptom of developmental failure, of needs unmet, of wounds unhealed, of a self that never learned how to regulate intense emotion because no one taught them, because no one was there to co-regulate with them in those crucial early years. Understanding origins is not the same as achieving transformation. but it is a necessary beginning. We cannot heal what we do not understand, cannot integrate what we refuse to acknowledge, cannot transform a force we experience only as alien possession rather than as an aspect, however dark and frightening, of our own psyche calling out for recognition and redemption. When rage fully possesses an individual, something terrifying occurs. The person ceases to be themselves. Those who have experienced this state, or witnessed it in others, describe it in language that has remained remarkably consistent across cultures and centuries. They speak of being taken over, of losing control, of watching themselves from outside as a stranger inhabits their body. The Greeks would say a daemon has seized them. Medieval Christians would speak of demonic possession. Modern psychology uses terms like dissociation and affect dysregulation, but the phenomenology remains the same. In the grip of rage, we become other than ourselves. This possession has a distinctive quality that differentiates it from other intense emotional states. In grief, we remain ourselves even as we suffer. In fear, we retain our identity even as we flee. But in rage, the very continuity of selfhood fractures. People report memories of rage episodes as fragmented, dreamlike, unreal. They recall their actions as if watching a film, with a sense of horrified disbelief. Did I really say that? Did I really do that? The answer is yes and no. You did it, but not the you that you recognize, not the you that you believe yourself to be. The phenomenologist Maurice Merleau-Ponty wrote of the lived body, the body as experienced from within rather than observed from without. In rage, this lived body becomes a stranger. The face contorts in ways we do not recognize when we later see ourselves in mirror or video. The voice emerges pitched and toned in ways that sound alien. The hands move with a violence we did not know we possessed. We become, quite literally, beside ourselves, standing outside the self we thought we were, watching in horror as something ancient and terrible uses our body as its instrument. The destruction that rage wreaks upon relationships is difficult to overstate. Words spoken in rage cannot be unspoken. They remain in the air long after the fury has passed, poisoning trust, introducing doubt, revealing abysses that perhaps were always there, but could be safely ignored until rage illuminated them with harsh and unforgiving light. The husband who calls his wife worthless in a moment of fury has introduced a wound that may never fully heal. The parent who screams at a child that they were a mistake has planted a seed of self-hatred that may grow for decades. These are not exaggerations. These are the actual case histories that fill therapists' offices, the confessions that come in the small hours when defenses drop and people face what they have done. Rage creates what we might call intimate terrorism, the systematic use of fear and intimidation within close relationships to maintain control. This is not the rage of a single explosive moment, but rage as a governing principle, rage as policy. The partner who flies into fury at minor infractions, who uses explosive anger to train others to walk on eggshells, who creates an atmosphere of perpetual vigilance and fear. This is rage, weaponized, rage as domination. And the terrible truth is that it works. People modify their behavior, suppress their needs, abandon their boundaries, all to avoid triggering the next eruption. The cycle of abuse follows a predictable pattern that rage perpetuates. Tension builds, often invisibly, as resentments accumulate and the rage simmers beneath the surface. Then comes the explosion, the release of accumulated fury in violence, emotional or physical. After the explosion, the honeymoon period, filled with apologies, promises, tenderness, designed to repair the damage and re-establish connection. But the underlying dynamics remain unchanged, and the cycle begins again, each rotation further eroding trust and safety until there is nothing left but fear and the desperate hope that this time will be different. But rage does not only destroy relationships with others, it turns inward with equal devastation, consuming the one who carries it. The relationship between rage and depression has been observed since antiquity. Freud posited that depression is anger turned inward, aggression that cannot be expressed externally, and so attacks the self instead. While this formulation is too simple to capture the full complexity of depression, there is truth in the observation that unexpressed rage often manifests as self-loathing, harsh internal criticism, punishing thoughts that flay the psyche with the same ferocity that might have been directed at others. The body also bears the cost of chronic rage. Hypertension, cardiovascular disease, immune suppression, chronic pain, these are not metaphors but measurable physiological consequences of a nervous system locked in perpetual stress response. The person who carries rage, even unexpressed rage, lives in a state of constant activation, stress hormones flooding the system, muscles chronically tensed, ready for battle that never quite comes, but never quite goes away. The exhaustion is profound, a bone-deep weariness that sleep cannot touch because the body never truly rests. Many turn to substances to manage the unbearable intensity of rage, to dull its edge or provide an excuse for its expression. Alcohol disinhibits, allowing rage that would otherwise be suppressed to emerge, providing the convenient excuse. I was drunk, I didn't mean it, that wasn't the real me. But alcohol does not create rage, it merely removes the thin veneer of control that keeps it hidden. The rage was always there, waiting. Stimulants can amplify irritability into fury. Sedatives may suppress but also numb, creating a different kind of death. The addiction becomes both symptom and attempted cure, a tragic effort to regulate what feels unregulable. In our current cultural moment, we have created what might be called rage economies, systems designed to profit from the systematic provocation and amplification of fury. Social media algorithms have discovered that nothing drives engagement quite like outrage. The posts that make us angry are the posts we share, comment on, return to obsessively. The platforms learn this and feed us more of what enrages us, creating filter bubbles of perpetual fury in which we are shown an endless stream of everything we hate, everything that confirms our worst suspicions about the other side, everything that justifies our contempt and fear. This is not accidental but by design. Engagement equals profit, and rage engages more reliably than joy, curiosity, or contemplation. We have built systems that algorithmically optimize for human fury, that learn to press our buttons with ever-increasing precision, that make us angrier year by year, because angry people click and share and stay on the platform, which is all that matters to the attention economy. The result is a culture in which many people live in a state of constant, low-grade rage, perpetually outraged by an endless parade of offenses delivered directly to their phones. This collective rage operates as a shadow phenomenon, the dark side of democracy and free expression. When everyone has a voice, when every grievance can find an audience, when rage can organize itself into movements and mobs with unprecedented speed and reach, we see both the power and the peril of unleashed collective emotion. The righteous fury that topples tyrants and demands justice can just as easily become the lynch mob, the witch hunt, the 2 minutes hate in which individual conscience dissolves into group frenzy. Literature has long understood rage in its extreme manifestations. Fyodor Dostoevsky's Underground Man embodies impotent rage, the fury of the intelligent but powerless individual who can act only through spite and petty revenge. He is consumed by resentment toward a world that does not recognize his superiority, that does not grant him the status he believes he deserves. His rage, having no legitimate outlet, turns into a slow poison that destroys him from within, making him incapable of love, of connection, of anything but bitter mockery of himself and others. In Euripides' Medea, we encounter rage in its most terrible and sacred form. When Jason abandons Medea for a more politically advantageous marriage, her fury is cosmic. She does not merely leave him or curse him, she murders their children. The ultimate act of revenge, knowing it will destroy him far more completely than his own death could. This is rage that will burn down the entire world rather than endure humiliation. Rage that chooses mutual destruction over submission. Rage that says, if I cannot have happiness, no one will. If you take everything from me, I will take everything from you. Herman Melville's Captain Ahab represents rage transformed into obsession, into mission, into a metaphysical rebellion against the nature of existence itself. The white whale that took his leg becomes a symbol of everything that wounds and thwarts and limits human aspiration. Ahab's rage drives him across the oceans, consumes his ship and crew, transforms what might have been grief or acceptance into an apocalyptic quest for vengeance against a creature that cannot understand vengeance, against the indifferent forces of nature itself. His final words, "Thus I give up the spear," acknowledge the futility, even as he cannot stop himself from the fatal throw. These literary figures reveal rage in its existential dimension, as a response not merely to personal wound but to the human condition itself, to mortality, to powerlessness, to the absence of cosmic justice. Their rage destroys them, yet there is something almost noble in their refusal to submit, to accept, to go gentle. They embody the terrible freedom of choosing destruction over accommodation, of saying no to existence itself rather than bowing to its terms. Yet, rage need not only destroy in our chemical tradition. Fire is both the most dangerous and the most necessary element in the work of transformation. The alchemists spoke of the prima materia, the base material that must undergo a series of operations to become gold. This raw material is often described as black, chaotic, containing both poison and cure. Rage is such a substance. It is the raw energy of the psyche, undifferentiated, potentially deadly, yet containing within it the very force needed for transformation if we can learn to work with it rather than be consumed by it. The first stage of the alchemical process is calcinatio, the burning away of everything superfluous, the reduction to ashes. Psychologically, this is what rage does when it erupts. It burns through pretense, through false niceness, through the carefully constructed persona we present to the world. In the fire of rage, we see what we really feel, what we have been suppressing, what remains when all the social conditioning is stripped away. This burning is necessary. What must be destroyed is not the self but the false self, the adapted self that has betrayed its own needs and values to please others or avoid conflict. But there is a crucial difference between being burned by fire and using fire consciously. The alchemist does not throw himself into the flames. He carefully controls the heat, knowing when to increase the temperature and when to let it cool, understanding that too much fire destroys the work entirely, while too little leaves it unchanged. This is the art we must learn with rage, to feel it fully without being consumed by it, to contain it without suppressing it, to let it burn through what needs to burn while protecting what must be preserved. Carl Jung wrote of the importance of conscious suffering, of staying with painful affects rather than acting them out or fleeing from them. This is perhaps the most difficult psychological work there is, to feel the full force of rage without immediately discharging it into action, to sit with that burning in the chest, that pressure in the throat, that impulse to destroy, and to not move, not speak, not act, but simply to endure it, to let it be there, to observe it with whatever consciousness we can muster in that moment. This containment is not the same as repression. Repression pushes the feeling into unconsciousness, where it festers and grows toxic. Containment holds the feeling in consciousness, acknowledges it, honors its presence, but does not grant it permission to act through us. It is like holding molten metal in a crucible. The metal remains molten, maintains its heat and intensity, but the crucible prevents it from spilling out and burning everything it touches. Active imagination offers a method for working with rage symbolically rather than literally. In this practice, developed by Jung, one enters into dialogue with the inner figures that carry our emotions, treating them not as mere psychological states, but as autonomous beings with their own perspectives and purposes. One might visualize the rage as a figure, a warrior, a fire demon, a volcanic force, and speak with it. Ask it what it wants, what it is protecting, what wound it guards. The answers that emerge often reveal the vulnerability beneath the fury, the legitimate need that has been violated, the boundary that must be restored. The warrior traditions understood something essential about rage. The berserker rage of the Viking warrior, the battle fury of the Celtic hero. These were not simply loss of control but cultivated states, entered into deliberately for specific purposes and, crucially, exited from when the battle was done. The warrior learns to access rage as a tool, a source of power and fearlessness when facing danger, but also learns to put that tool down when it is no longer needed. The martial arts, particularly those rooted in spiritual discipline, teach this discrimination, this ability to be fully capable of violence yet choosing restraint, to carry fire without being burned by it. This is the transformation from berserker to guardian, from rage that destroys indiscriminately to strength that protects what is valuable. The parent who sets a firm boundary with a defiant teenager draws on anger's energy but channels it into clarity and resolve rather than punishment. The activist who confronts injustice uses the fuel of righteous anger but directs it towards systemic change rather than personal vengeance. This is rage refined, rage in service to something beyond itself. Creative work offers another path for the transformation of rage. The artist who paints with fury, the writer who channels rage into words, the musician who pounds out their anger on drums, these are not merely expressing emotion but transmuting it, converting raw psychic energy into form, into beauty, into meaning. Picasso's Guernica is rage made visible. The horror and fury at the bombing of civilians transformed into one of the 20th century's most powerful artworks. The punk rock movement channeled a generation's rage at social hypocrisy into a new musical form. James Baldwin wrote his fury at racism into essays that burned with controlled fire, illuminating rather than merely destroying. The spiritual traditions approach rage with varying degrees of acceptance and methods of transformation. In Buddhism, anger is recognized as one of the three poisons, along with greed and delusion, that bind us to suffering. The practice is not to act on anger, but to observe it with mindfulness, to see it arise, burn, and pass away like all phenomena, to recognize it as empty of inherent existence, a temporary arising in consciousness that we need not identify with or be controlled by. Yet Tibetan Buddhism also depicts wrathful deities, fierce protectors whose apparent rage is actually compassion in its most uncompromising form, the fierce determination to destroy illusion and protect the Dharma. Christianity contains a similar paradox. Turn the other cheek, love your enemies. Yet Jesus himself displays fierce anger when driving the money changers from the temple, when condemning the hypocrisy of religious authorities. This is righteous anger, fury in service to justice and truth, channeled not into personal revenge but into the defense of what is sacred. The challenge is discernment, knowing when our rage is righteous and when it is merely self-righteous, when it serves truth and when it serves only ego. In Sufism, divine discontent is recognized as a necessary stage on the spiritual path, a holy dissatisfaction with the self as it is that drives the seeker toward transformation. This is rage turned toward one's own complacency, one's own accommodation to less than one could be. It is the fire that will not let us settle, that burns through comfort and security, that demands we become what we are capable of becoming regardless of the cost. The integrated individual does not eliminate rage but develops a relationship with it, learns to recognize its arising, to understand its messages, to use its energy without being used by it. This requires developing what we might call the observing ego, the part of consciousness that can witness our own emotional states without being completely identified with them. When rage arises, a small voice says, "I notice that I am feeling rage," rather than simply, "I am rage." This slight distance, this sliver of consciousness, makes all the difference. Practically, this integration requires developing somatic awareness, learning to recognize the early physical signs of rage before it reaches overwhelming intensity. The tightening in the chest, the heat rising in the face, the clenching of fists. These are signals that give us perhaps seconds or minutes before the threshold is crossed. In those moments, we have choices. Breathe. Move the body. Step away from the triggering situation. Count to 10, as Seneca advised millennia ago, not because it is sophisticated, but because it works. We must also learn to distinguish when rage is appropriate and when it is projection, when it is a response to actual present injustice, and when it is a response to past wounds being triggered by present circumstances. The rage that arises when witnessing cruelty to a child is appropriate and potentially life-saving. The rage that erupts when a partner forgets to buy milk is likely about something else entirely, some deeper wound or pattern being activated. There are times when rage is not only appropriate but necessary, when it is the only sane response to genuine horror and injustice, when anything less than fury would constitute a moral failure. The person who feels no rage at genocide, at torture, at systematic oppression, has not transcended anger, but has deadened something essential in their humanity. The challenge is to feel such rage without becoming consumed by it, to let it move us to action without letting it possess us completely, to use its energy in service of change rather than merely in service of destruction. The fire within can consume us or forge us. This is the final paradox, the truth that cannot be resolved but only lived. Rage demands expression, yet requires containment. It must be felt but not obeyed, known but not identified with, honored but not worshipped. To repress it entirely is to become dead, numb, unable to respond to violation. To express it without consciousness is to become destructive, hurting ourselves and others. The middle way is not moderation but consciousness. The difficult work of staying present with intense affect, of holding the tension of opposites until something new can emerge. Jung wrote that the psychological rule says we are never made whole by living at the expense of the soul, by living out of the ego's conscious desires, while ignoring the messages from the depths. Rage is such a message, arising from depths we have ignored at our peril, demanding attention, insisting on recognition. The question is not whether we will have rage, we will, but whether we will have the courage to face it, to understand it, to transform it into something other than destruction. This is the ongoing work, the practice of a lifetime. There is no final victory over rage, no point at which we graduate beyond its reach. There is only the daily choice to meet it with consciousness rather than unconsciousness, to use it rather than be used by it, to let the fire within illuminate and warm rather than consume and destroy. In this choice, made over and over, we forge ourselves into something stronger than we were, tempered by the very heat that might have destroyed us.